Welcome to lesson 12.5. With all the recent immigration that's been happening in our story of Canada, how did that affect that of the Francophones that were living here in Western Canada? So stick around and let's learn something. All right, it's 12.5. We are going to take a look at how the arrival of immigrants from different parts of the world affected the Francophone people here in Western Canada. Like I said, this is lesson 12.5. At one point in the history of Canada West, the Francophones were the majority group of people, and over time they became the minority. Now, they weren't the first in the West. The First Nations were the original people in the West, who were later then joined by the Canadiens and the Scottish in the fur trade. Then the Métis and homesteaders begin to join. Immigrants start coming over, and now all have a different culture and all are bringing their own languages. But they all have the same motive, and that is to live in Western Canada. The Francophones are who we're going to take a look at today, and they were there in the West. They developed their communities right after Confederation. And the Métis, the Canadiens, and people from Belgium and France, French immigrants, they came out west, and they were lured out here because the government of Canada promised a bilingual society, which is one of the foundations of Confederation in Canada, to have these two languages. And they thought that's what was going to happen here in the West. So the Francophones, they started coming over, and their culture and their language were very strong in the West. But the government agents that the government of Canada sent out to attract immigrants to Western Canada, they went to non-French speaking areas of the world to encourage immigration, I should say. So the people that were coming over, they weren't Francophones, which means that French no longer was the main language in Western Canada, and it was English that started replacing French as the main language. And it was expected that the new immigrants coming to Canada were going to learn English, and that is what they did. The French language really was threatened here in Western Canada. And eventually, over time, we see that English does replace French. You're listening to this right now. It's in English. Je ne parle pas français. I'm not speaking French right now. I am speaking English. But that lure of a French bilingual, not a French, but of a bilingual country comes back to the Constitution Act of 1867, where it guarantees a bilingual parliament. It guarantees a bilingual French assembly, so that's the provincial government in Quebec. It guarantees bilingual laws. It guarantees bilingual courts. And in government, it guarantees that French and English are made equal. The Manitoba Act of 1870 is further proof of these guarantees set out in the Constitution Act of 1867. The Manitoba Act of 1870 pleases the Francophones because it made Manitoba a bilingual country. So this is proof that the West is going to be bilingual. That doesn't last very long. In 1890, 20 years later, Manitoba decides to make English the only official language in the province, which means it is protected by law, which means French is no longer recognized in Manitoba government or in Manitoba courts. But this later gets overturned by the Supreme Court of Canada in 1979. But this change to English only really hurts our French communities, who thought that the West was going to be a bilingual place in society. The Northwest Territories, so that's Alberta and Saskatchewan, they were bilingual since 1877. Frederick Haultain, this individual right here, the Haultain Resolution of 1892, though, makes English the only language of government. So now we're starting to see a problem here if you are bilingual or if you are Francophone. But in 1988, the Supreme Court ruled that this Haultain Resolution that passed in 1892 was not a valid law. It was not a valid resolution. So Alberta and Saskatchewan quickly go and make English the official language. Okay, but what about schools? They're not going to change the schools, are they? Well, let's take a look at the Manitoba Schools question. We know that in the West, most of the schools that were here were Catholic schools. Most immigrants were Roman Catholic. And under the Manitoba Act of 1870, these rights were enshrined. They were guaranteed. And it said that the language of instruction was to be French. That's great when you have a Francophone community. But more and more Protestants arrived in the West. Protestants are not Catholic, so therefore they're making non-Catholic schools where the language of instruction was English. Eventually, over time, just like with immigration, Protestant schools will outnumber Catholic schools. And in 1890, so 20 years after the Manitoba Act of 1870, the government of Manitoba voted to stop Catholic school funding with the hope of having a single system with English instruction to save money. So your family has come out here, Confederation has enshrined the rights of a bilingual nation. So obviously the Catholic school families are going to be outraged because they're arguing that the Confederation Constitution Act of 1867 and the Manitoba Act of 1870 guaranteed a separate school system. And this became a national debate. But the federal government decides not to intervene, even though it's the constitutional right of the French Catholic system in the West to be able to have it. It's not until years later that in 1896, Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier, who is here on the right-hand side of this cartoon, and Manitoba Premier Thomas Greenway, who's on the left side of the cartoon, reach a compromise. And the compromise says that the Catholics have a right to religious teachings in school. And it further goes and says that if there are 10 or more Francophone students in a school, they have the right to then be instructed in French. But in Manitoba, the Catholic families do not get their school system back. What about here in Alberta and Saskatchewan? Well, we're going to go back to when Alberta and Saskatchewan were part of the Northwest Territories. In 1892, English became the instruction of school. And 90 years later, in 1982, something called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I have a picture of it right here. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms, one of the things that makes Canada so great was introduced into legislation, and it recognized Francophones in Western Canada do actually have rights to education. So under their minority language educational rights, if you have a significant population of Francophones outside of Quebec, so the Francophones then are the minority official language, then they have the right to a Francophone French education. The same is true as if you are an English minority living out or living inside of Quebec. You have the right for an Anglophone school. Guess where you're going to learn more about this? In grade 9 social. But in 1982, this became law, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But until then, until 1982, if the Francophones wanted to preserve their culture and the Catholic culture, then the preservation was solely on them. So what did they do? Well, they published their own newspapers. They built their own hospitals. They built churches. They started their own radio stations. They began private schools and private colleges, all trying to hold on to that Francophone identity. Which brings us here to Alberta. And you learned about this in grade 4 social studies, the Franco Albertans. Okay, these are Franco Albertans. These are people in Alberta who are Francophones. In 1982, when the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was enacted into legislation, there was Section 23, which says all Anglophones and Francophone minorities have education rights, which means you have the right to an education in your minority language if it is English or French, because Canada is bilingual, French and English. So if you live outside of Quebec and you speak French, you have the right to a French education. If you are English living inside Quebec, you have the right to an English education. It's your right to education in your minority language. But that only applies to French and English because that is what is written in the Constitution Act of 1867. Okay? So if you speak any other languages outside of French or English, you do not have that right. So if you speak Italian, you do not have the right to attend an Italian school. Okay? Only if you are French or English and you are the minority language in that area. It seems very confusing. You're being introduced to it now, but you will in a few years' time be taking a much closer look at Section 23 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And then you talk about how immigration plays an important role in maintaining Francophone identity outside of Quebec, how it maintains identity inside Quebec, and same with Anglophone identity inside Quebec. So Alberta Francophones, after 1982, they opened 2 Francophone schools because of Section 23 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. They opened up a school in Edmonton and they opened up a school in Calgary. And in 1988 and 1983, the Alberta School Act changes so that it recognizes Section 23 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which means the Alberta School Act then says, okay, yeah, Canada is a bilingual country where French and English are equal. And if there is a population, a significant population of Francophones in Alberta, then they have the right to a Francophone education. And as you drive around the city, as you drive around Alberta, you can see that there are many Francophone schools around. And here in our city, for example, you can go to the south side near Faculté Saint-Jean, and that's our little French district. And that's our Francophone district here in the city. But you can see here on this map, there are Francophone communities throughout Alberta with their own schools. All right, I want you to head over to your notebook and complete the questions for this part of the chapter.